She stood at the corner of a busy Chicago street, clutching a torn grocery bag, her voice trembling as she pleaded for help with food for her children. Commuters hurried past, eyes averted, while a well-dressed man lingered at the edge of the crowd, watching, unsure if he should step in or keep his distance. No one asked why a mother would have to beg with her kids right there, and yet something about the way she looked back over her shoulder made it impossible to walk away. What's really going on behind this moment? If this story stirs something in you, if you've ever wondered what's truly hidden beneath the surface, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts below. Your presence here means more than you know. Daniel Barrett stood alone in his penthouse high in Willis Tower, staring through rain-streaked windows at the city below. The world beneath him glimmered in fractured lights, each droplet of rain refracting Chicago's restless energy. Yet, for Daniel, there was no comfort in this silent luxury. His apartment was too quiet, every surface pristine, every clock tick amplified in the absence of Olivia, his late wife. Sometimes he caught himself talking to her ghost, only to hear the emptiness echo back. It was the sort of night when loneliness felt absolute, a heaviness that lingered no matter how many zeros he saw on a balance sheet. Lake Michigan, lost in a curtain of rain, seemed to blur the city's edges, as if everything solid could dissolve and drift away. He found himself drawn to the window, pulled by the vague ache of needing to witness someone else's world for a while, far below. Brookside Market glowed dimly. There, on the edge of its awning, he saw a cluster of figures, 5 in all, hunched against the wind and rain. They were motionless for a moment, a family suspended in a world that refused them shelter. The woman stood slightly apart, shoulders squared, hair plastered to her cheeks. Her 4 daughters, close in age, huddled against her, faces half hidden, clothes clinging to small frames. Daniel squinted, pressing a hand against the glass, feeling the absurdity of his vantage point, how a few hundred feet could separate comfort from desperation. Minutes later, Daniel was in the elevator, descending past empty lobbies and polished security desks, the echo of his own footsteps reinforcing just how little he belonged to any real world tonight. He took his car from the underground garage, merging into traffic along West Wacker Drive. The rain seemed even harsher at street level, battering the windshield with a rhythm that matched his unquiet thoughts. He told himself he was only curious, but the truth was more complicated. He remembered Olivia's words. It's not enough to have sympathy from a distance. Sometimes you have to get your hands wet. He parked beside Brookside Market, engine running, wipers clicking. From this vantage, the scene sharpened the mother Emily Reynolds, though he didn't know her name, yet pleaded softly with the market's manager, a stern-faced woman in a red apron who gestured toward a sign reading, "No loitering, no soliciting." Emily's voice barely carried, but her posture was unyielding. Her daughters pressed closer, the youngest, no more than 4, shivered, clutching a threadbare plush toy. Passers-by offered quick, awkward glances, each averting their eyes, as if empathy itself were a luxury best kept in check. Daniel stepped out into the rain, locking the car behind him. He paused, feeling the weight of the moment, the divide between those who could act and those who merely watched. He approached slowly, umbrella in hand, and stood beneath the awning, the spray from the street pooling around his shoes. The market manager turned on him, irritation sparking in her tone. "We're not running a shelter here, sir. If you're not buying, I'll have to ask you to move along." Daniel met her gaze evenly, not rising to her challenge. Instead, he addressed Emily. "Is there something I can do?" His words were simple, but the strain in his voice made them real. Emily hesitated, lips trembling with both pride and exhaustion. She shielded her girls behind her, one hand hovering protectively over the eldest shoulder. "We just need food," she managed, barely more than a whisper. The manager cut in again, saying store policy forbade handouts, that they couldn't risk trouble with the neighborhood watch or the police. Emily's face fell, and for a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering down. Daniel felt a cold anger stir not for Emily, but for the indifference built into every rule. He opened the umbrella, held it over Emily and her children. "Come with me," he said quietly. "You shouldn't be out here." They hesitated. The children stared at him, eyes dark and luminous, searching for threat or promise. The eldest, Emma, looked especially guarded, like a child who had learned that every offer might carry a price. But Emily, running out of options and courage, finally nodded. They walked with Daniel to his car. He opened the back door for the girls, offering a gentle smile that felt awkward on his lips. The little ones climbed in first, Emma and Grace, helping Nora and Lucy. Rainwater pooled at their feet, mingling with crumbs and bits of gravel on the floor mat. Emily sat in the front seat, still half-turned, checking her daughters with every move. Inside the car, Daniel kept the heat running, silence stretching between them as he searched for the right words. He tried asking if there was somewhere he could take them. Emily shook her head, eyes fixed on the dashboard. "There's nowhere tonight. My mother's sick. We've been staying with her, but she can't help anymore. We're just—" Her voice trailed off, the shame sharp and clear. One of the girls, Grace, fumbled in her coat and pressed a folded paper into Daniel's hand. The paper trembled in his grip as he unfolded it. The letters were written in a child's uncertain hand. "Grandma is sick. No food left. Please help." Daniel sat there for a moment, unable to answer the questions that filled his mind. How does anyone end up here, desperate and invisible on a night like this? What would Olivia have done? He thought of the apartment above, full of warmth and light, untouched by suffering. But he didn't look back, not yet. The city lights bled across the windshield, reflecting a world too large and too indifferent for a single act of kindness to fix. But in this small space, with 5 strangers and a single note, something fragile and stubborn pressed against the night. He glanced once more at Emily, then at the children in the mirror. None of them spoke. But when Daniel put the car in gear and pulled away from Brookside Market, he knew nothing would be the same, not for any of them. The night rain tapered off as Daniel guided Emily and her 4 girls into Lakeside Diner on North Clark Street, the kind of neighborhood spot where truckers and night shift nurses came for coffee, and regulars always knew the manager's name. It was late. The diner's warmth was a sharp contrast to the soaked streets outside. Neon flickered above the windows, and inside, the hum of conversation was punctuated by the rattle of plates and the hiss of the espresso machine. Daniel held the door and let Emily shepherd her daughters to the last booth, back by the window, where the condensation drew misty halos around their faces. The overhead bulb glowed gold against the wet strands of their hair, highlighting the fatigue that clung to each of them. Daniel slid into the seat across from Emily. He was still wearing his expensive coat, water droplets sparkling on the sleeves. He kept his movements slow, measured, careful not to crowd the table. Emily bunched her shoulders, wiping at Nora's damp cheek with the cuff of her sleeve, while Emma and Grace sat close together, arms pressed tight. Lucy tugged at her mother's elbow, her own eyes wide with uncertainty. The waitress arrived, gaze darting from Daniel to the rest, her lips pursed, as if weighing a silent judgment before finally offering coffee, hot chocolate for the kids. Daniel nodded, ordering 4 hot chocolates, grilled cheese sandwiches, soup, and for himself, only black coffee. As the food arrived, the girls' hesitation melted just enough for them to eat, their hunger overpowering self-consciousness. Emma, the oldest, watched every move in the diner. Each time the bell jingled above the door, her back stiffened, her gaze never fully relaxing. Daniel noticed, quietly passing extra napkins, refilling waters, asking the waitress for a second basket of bread. Emily's hands shook slightly as she reached for her coffee, the knuckles white against the porcelain. The small talk Daniel tried at first, questions about schools, favorite foods, what they liked to read, met only with tight-lipped answers or silence. The conversation thinned, stretching into pauses. Daniel tried again. "So, what brings you all out here tonight?" He kept his tone neutral, but there was steel in it, a businessman's insistence, the kind that left little room for deflection. Emily hesitated, glancing down at the table. She recited her losses with a flatness that betrayed exhaustion. Lost her job at the hospital last month. Her mother's health failing fast. Rent overdue. No child support. Every word seemed to cost her something, each confession adding to a burden she could barely carry. Grace nibbled at her sandwich, glancing up at Emma, who was carefully tucking part of her bread into a napkin and sliding it into her pocket. Daniel caught the movement, said nothing. He recognized the signs of a child trained by scarcity, always planning for the next hunger. The noise in the diner faded to a background hum. Emily fidgeted, pulling from her purse a worn, crumpled sheet of paper, a job application for a cleaning position at the nearby hospital. She set it on the table, smoothing the creases. I was supposed to turn this in today. I missed the deadline. Daniel looked at the form, then at her. You're not out of options. Emily, he said quietly, but tonight, you need rest. You and the girls can stay at a place I keep for guests. Just a night. You can decide what's next after. Emily's jaw clenched. There was pride there, and a trace of fear. Why are you helping us? She asked, her voice so soft he barely caught it. Daniel's answer was plain. Because I can. Emily seemed torn between hope and suspicion, weighing the offer like someone who'd seen kindness twist into obligation before. She nodded finally, brushing Lucy's hair back from her forehead. Emma whispered something to Grace that Daniel couldn't hear, but both girls' faces eased a little. The waitress brought the check without being asked, eyes lingering on Emily as if searching for something familiar in her story. Daniel paid in cash, leaving a tip large enough to hush further questions. As they left, the girls clustered around their mother, stepping quickly into the new cold of the night. Outside, the world was quieter but no less uncertain. Daniel led them to his car, parked beneath a flickering street lamp. As he helped Emily shepherd her daughters into the back seat, he sensed eyes on them. Across the street, a black SUV idled at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting nothing but city light. The engine hummed low, steady, a presence that didn't belong to the night's anonymity. Daniel watched for a moment, memorizing the shape of the vehicle, the silhouette behind the steering wheel. Something in the set of Emily's shoulders said she'd seen it too, though she said nothing. He opened the passenger door, motioning for Emily to get in, then paused before taking the driver's seat. There was a new tension in the air, uncertainty, and something darker threading through the small victories of the evening. As Daniel started the engine, the girls huddled together, Emma glancing back once at the diner, then at the SUV, then at Daniel, as if trying to gauge which direction the next storm would come from. He pulled away from the curb, headlights casting long shadows on the slick asphalt, and the SUV eased from its spot, following at a distance. The city felt less like home, more like a maze of intentions some kind, some waiting for the right moment to close in. Daniel drove the family in silence through Chicago's north side, the city lights flickering across the windshield. The rain had faded to a mist, but the air outside was still raw, the sort of cold that seeps into the bones. He turned onto North Clark Street and parked beside a narrow alley that led to a small, two-story brick building. On the first floor was the garage, usually empty this time of night. Above it, a modest apartment, a space he once reserved for visiting staff or friends down on their luck, stood quiet and dark, waiting. Daniel led Emily and her daughters up a side staircase, the metal steps groaning under their weight. Inside, the apartment was plain but cared for. Clean sheets on the beds, fresh towels folded in the bathroom, boxes of cereal and canned soup stacked in the pantry. Daniel moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, switching on lamps, opening windows to let in air, changing the sheets on the lower bunk himself. Emily stood near the doorway. The children clustered around her. She held her purse close, scanning the room as if searching for signs of threat or hidden cost. The girls spread out, tentative at first, Emma peering out the rain-dappled window at the city below, Grace tracing a finger along the bookshelf, Nora and Lucy clinging to their mother's coat. Daniel paused in the kitchen, opening the fridge and lining up bottles of juice, packs of cheese, and a tray of apples. He set a kettle on the stove for tea. There was a quiet pride in his movements, the kind of hospitality that expected no thanks. Emily's gratitude flickered in her eyes, but something uncertain lingered just beneath the surface. He handed her the apartment key, placing it gently in her palm. "You're safe here," he said, voice steady. "No one will bother you." For a moment, Emily seemed overwhelmed by the gesture. She glanced at the children, then back at Daniel. "You don't have to go to all this trouble," she murmured. "We won't be in the way. We'll only stay one night." Daniel shook his head. "Stay as long as you need. There's no rush." He folded a blanket for Lucy, draping it across the sofa, and set a glass of water beside Emma's bed. He noticed Emma and Grace watching him, their eyes tracking every move, as if waiting for the rules to change or the welcome to be rescinded. Lucy, the youngest, broke the quiet. She tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Are we staying here forever?" "Mama." Her voice was small, hopeful. Emily knelt, gathering Lucy into her arms. She didn't answer, only pressed her cheek to the child's hair. Daniel stood in the doorway, feeling the heaviness in the room shift, the balance between relief and anxiety tipping with every breath. As he prepared to leave, Daniel lingered by the window. His gaze drifted over the cityscape, the lights reflecting off the wet pavement. It would be easy, he thought, to walk away now, lock the door behind him, retreat to the penthouse, let this family become just another story on the street. But something held him there, some unfinished chord from the past. He watched as Emily tucked Nora and Lucy into the lower bunk, Emma and Grace settling in beside them, the exhaustion of the day finally easing in the glow of a safe room. On his way out, Daniel's hand paused on the doorknob. He turned to look at Emily one last time, her silhouette framed by the soft light. There was a question in her eyes, a silent request for reassurance that she didn't dare speak. He nodded, slow and certain, then stepped into the hall. He made it as far as the parking lot before his phone buzzed in his pocket. The message came from an unlisted number, only a few words, but enough to chill him. "Stay away from the Sinclairs." Daniel stared at the screen, his thoughts scrambling back through years of litigation, corporate rivalry, and the memory of Olivia, his late wife, pouring her heart into a medical innovation, only to watch it stripped away by Robert Sinclair's maneuvering. Emily Sinclair. That realization landed with a force that made him stumble. She was Robert's ex-wife. Their feud wasn't finished, not by a long stretch. For a moment, Daniel stood motionless, caught in the weight of past and present colliding. The rain started again, gentler this time, tapping against the hood of his car. He watched the apartment window, saw Emily's shadow as she checked on her girls, and felt the full ache of responsibility settle in his chest. Everything had changed, and the lines between mercy, history, and justice were already blurring in the night air. He didn't move, just stood there under the glow of the street lamp, listening to the city breathe, wondering how many lives could shift in a single evening. The morning air was brisk on North Clark Street, the city still shaking off the remnants of the previous night's rain. Daniel arrived early at the small parking lot beneath the apartment, his mind restless, replaying the events that had led him here. The usual calm that the city's routines brought him was gone. As he reached his car, a tall man in a dark security jacket lingered near the rear bumper, pretending to check the meters. There was something off about him, his posture too stiff, his gaze too calculating. Daniel slowed his pace, watching the man's hands. He noticed the flash of a silver ring, distinctive and familiar, the crest of the Sinclair Group, Robert's old company. Their eyes met for a moment. The stranger offered a curt nod, then walked away without a word, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. As Daniel drew closer, he found a folded note tucked beneath his windshield wiper. The message, scribbled in sharp handwriting, read, "She and her girls owe Robert more than you know." The threat wasn't direct, but the intent was clear. A sense of dread tightened in Daniel's chest, pulling him back toward a history he had fought hard to bury. He crumpled the note, tucking it into his coat pocket, and scanned the street for any sign of the man. But he was already gone, vanished into the stream of commuters heading toward the city center. Upstairs. Emily was already awake, moving quietly through the apartment so as not to wake the girls. She tried to busy herself tidying the kitchen, sorting through her few belongings, but her movements were tense, distracted. Her phone rang suddenly, the screen flashing an unknown number. She hesitated, heart thudding. When she answered, there was no greeting, only the sound of a long, drawn-out sigh, followed by a gravelly voice. "Your ex-husband isn't finished with you yet." The line went dead. Emily clutched the phone, her hands trembling. For a long moment, she stared at the faded wallpaper, breathing through the panic that pressed in around her. The girls sensed something was wrong. Emma watched her mother closely, noticing the subtle way she folded in on herself, the way her voice tightened as she called them for breakfast. Lucy clung to Emily's side. Grace and Nora whispered to each other at the table, their eyes flicking back and forth between the adults. Daniel knocked softly on the door, bringing bagels and orange juice. He tried to appear cheerful, but the strain showed in his face. Emma, bolder than before, pulled him aside as he set the food down. "You won't leave my mom, will you?" Her question was quiet, but it carried the weight of a child who had learned not to trust the future. Daniel knelt to her level, searching her eyes for the right words. "No, Emma," he said gently. "I won't leave her." Emma studied him for a moment, then nodded, accepting his promise with a seriousness beyond her years. He saw in her expression the same fierce protectiveness that Olivia once had a willingness to carry burdens no child should bear. After breakfast, Daniel excused himself and made a call to Teresa Fields, his attorney at Highland Park and Associates. They spoke in low voices outside the apartment, away from curious ears. He asked her to dig into the old legal battles between Barrett Innovations and Sinclair Group. He wanted to know everything that had been hidden, every backroom deal, every name that had disappeared from the records. Teresa listened, her tone cautious. "Be careful, Daniel," she warned. "People with Robert's reach don't let go easily." Her words lingered long after the call ended. Daniel returned to the apartment late that afternoon. As he turned the key in the lock, a chill ran through him. The door opened too easily. Inside, the rooms had been ransacked. Drawers yanked open, papers scattered across the floor. Emily's few possessions tossed aside. Emily stood frozen in the center of the living room, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping a shredded envelope. "They took my mother's medical records," she whispered. The girls huddled together by the window, watching with wide, silent eyes. Daniel moved through the space, taking stock of what was missing. Important documents gone. Even a photograph of Emily's mother was missing from the frame on the mantel. He felt a deep anger rise in him, a helplessness he hadn't known since the darkest days after Olivia's death. Someone had sent a message. Nothing here was private, and safety was only an illusion. He gathered the girls into the kitchen, trying to offer comfort, his presence the only shield he could give. That night, Daniel sat on the steps outside the apartment, the city's lights blurring in the distance. The weight of old rivalries pressed down, the knowledge that Robert Sinclair was still playing games from the shadows. Daniel realized he could no longer keep the past at arm's length, not for Emily, not for her daughters, and not for himself. He didn't move for a long time, just watched the night deepen around him, the promise of another storm, always waiting in the dark. The morning began with the sound of cautious voices and the sharp scent of coffee, brewing in a pot too old for its job. Daniel called Teresa Fields, his attorney from Highland Park and Associates, before the sun had fully crested the skyline. She arrived promptly, her briefcase in hand, gray hair pinned in a neat bun, expression unreadable. Daniel let her in with a heavy nod, and together they stepped into the apartment above the garage, the air thick with the unsettled energy from the break-in the night before. The living room bore clear traces of intrusion. Drawers hung open, the cheap particle board warped from rough handling. Books and clothes spilled across the floor, personal papers scattered like leaves in a storm, the remnants of normal life children's drawings, a sock missing its pair. A faded photograph taped to the fridge seemed to anchor the space against the violation, but only just. Teresa moved slowly, examining each detail, her eyes pausing over the mess with professional detachment. Emily sat at the edge of the sofa, hands folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. The girls stayed close, Emma and Grace in the far corner, Nora and Lucy curled on a blanket, silent. Emily struggled to answer Teresa's gentle but insistent questions about what exactly was missing. My mother's medical records, some court documents, nothing worth money, she murmured, not meeting anyone's gaze. When Teresa asked about other threats, Emily's cheeks flushed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Robert always said he'd make me regret fighting him. He knows I can't afford another lawyer. I signed what he wanted, I just wanted it over. Daniel felt a cold anger stir beneath his composure. It was all too familiar years ago. Barrett Innovations had been dragged through the courts by Sinclair Group, their research maligned in the press, their funding sabotaged. Olivia, his late wife, had poured everything into a cancer therapy, only to see it tied up in litigation. Hope whittled away by legal tricks and corporate ruthlessness. Daniel had told himself he'd moved on, but now, seeing the shadows in Emily's face, the old helplessness returned, tinged with regret and shame. Teresa discovered a contract hidden in the pages of a worn children's book Lucy had been reading. The paper was creased and yellowed at the edges. Scrawled across the top in red ink, in Robert's precise hand, were the words, "Only 7 days left." Emily shrank into herself as Teresa read the terms, harsh penalties, impossible deadlines, vague threats about child custody. He said he'd take the girls if I didn't pay, Emily admitted, the words sticking in her throat. He made me sign over everything after the divorce. I thought if I stayed quiet, he'd leave us alone. Emma glanced up from the floor, her eyes full of questions she was too young to voice. Grace held her sister's hand, watching the adults with the wary patience of a child who'd learned early to stay alert when grown-ups whispered. Daniel tried to reassure Emily, but each attempt sounded thin, unconvincing even to his own ears. "We'll fight this," he told her. "You're not alone this time." He meant it, but he felt the weight of the promise settle on his shoulders, heavier than he'd expected. Teresa was careful as she packed up the contract and took photographs of the damage. She explained that without clear evidence of forced entry or witnesses, the police would do little. "Robert has friends everywhere," she said quietly, her tone a blend of warning and apology. "He's connected. If we're going to challenge him, we need to be smarter than he expects. And fast." The conversation shifted as Emily revealed what she'd kept hidden, how Robert had used the girls as leverage during the divorce, threatening to call Child Protective Services if she resisted, reminding her that money would always win in the end. Daniel listened, jaw set, anger simmering beneath the surface. Teresa offered what comfort she could, but the room felt smaller for all that had been left unsaid. By dusk, the apartment was mostly back in order, but the sense of violation lingered. Daniel looked out the window as twilight settled over North Clark Street. A black SUV idled across the road, its engine purring softly, headlights off. Emily saw it too. She stood behind Daniel, her hand trembling as she drew the curtain shut. "He won't let us go," she whispered, the words half to herself, half to the shadows beyond the glass. Teresa packed her things, glancing once more at Daniel. "Be careful. We're not just fighting an old lawsuit anymore. You're in his world now." Daniel nodded, watching her leave, his mind already racing through strategies, phone calls, old contacts he'd hoped never to use again. The girls clustered near the kitchen, their laughter gone, replaced by the hush of children who understood more than they should. Night crept in, filling the apartment with uneasy quiet. Daniel lingered by the door, the promise he'd made to Emily replaying in his mind. Across the street, the SUV remained, a silent sentinel of unfinished business. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, the next line to be crossed. He didn't sleep, just watched the taillights glow red through the slats of the blinds, knowing that some wars never truly ended. Millennium Park, on a late spring morning, was filled with the kind of promise that only comes after days of rain. The grass was still wet, the air cool and sweet, and the clouded skyline of Chicago loomed steady as ever behind the trees. Emily sat on a weathered bench, watching her daughters, Emma, Grace, Nora, and Lucy, run and tumble across the small playground. Their laughter sounded brighter here, echoing across the walkways. For a few moments, the world seemed simple again. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket, snapping her from the lull of ordinary peace. The screen displayed an unfamiliar email address. She hesitated, glancing instinctively at Emma. Her eldest always sensed when her mother's mood changed. Emily opened the message, her heart skipping at what she saw an old photograph, attached without comment. Two women smiled into the camera, arms around each other. She recognized herself, 8 years younger, and next to her stood Olivia Barrett Daniels' late wife, radiating the kind of light that made everyone else seem brighter, too. The backdrop was a conference room at Northwestern University, the banner behind them proclaiming the 10th Annual Medical Innovation Summit. The photograph hit her like a blow. She remembered that conference, the hours spent discussing new therapies, the hopefulness, the sense of shared purpose. What she couldn't understand was why, of all times, someone would send this image to her now. The subject line just, her maiden name. Emily Sinclair gave nothing away. There was no message, no signature. Emily's hands shook as she turned the phone off and slid it into her bag. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived at the park. He brought bagels from a cafe on Wabash and offered them without a word, his eyes tracking the girls as they played. Emily hesitated before showing him the photo. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "That was a good day," he said quietly, voice catching in his throat. "We thought we could change the world, back then." He handed the phone back, gaze never quite meeting hers. They sat in silence until Emily, almost in a whisper, said, "There's something I never told you, Daniel. Back then, Olivia gave me a copy of her last research protocol. She wanted me to keep it safe, away from company lawyers, just in case. I never thought Robert would find out, but he did. He's been threatening me for years, first about the girls, then about this." She drew a breath, shaky but determined. "If you'd rather we left?" Daniel shook his head, his expression unreadable. "No. But I need to know everything now, Emily. This is bigger than just you or me. I won't let you carry it alone." He kept his voice gentle, but there was resolve beneath the words. She nodded, relief flickering through her tension. Suddenly, Emma sprinted across the grass, cheeks flushed, hair flying. She grabbed Daniel's sleeve, pulling him aside. "There was a man at the swings," she whispered. "He was asking Nora and me where we live. He didn't look like anyone from school." Emily stiffened, scanning the park, but the only faces she saw were parents and nannies. Still, a chill settled at the base of her spine. Daniel reacted at once, calling the Chicago police non-emergency line, describing the incident with practiced calm. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol, but by the time the officers arrived, the stranger was gone, vanished into the crowd. Emily hugged her daughters close, murmuring comfort, but her eyes stayed on the edges of the park, searching for threats she couldn't name. Daniel stayed with them until the patrol car had left, then offered to drive the family back to the apartment, his protective instinct fully awake. It was only after they'd settled back in, the doors locked and curtains drawn, that Daniel checked his own phone. There was a new notification, this time a text, no number attached. The message was as cryptic as it was unsettling. "Meet me at Michigan Avenue Bridge, 10:00 p.m. I'll tell you the truth about Robert Sinclair." He stared at the screen, feeling the pull of old secrets rising from beneath the calm surface of his life. The city outside seemed to shift and darken, every shadow suddenly heavy with meaning. Emily watched him from across the room, concern etched in the lines of her face. Daniel forced a smile, but the unease didn't fade. The photograph, the stranger in the park, the anonymous invitation. All of it formed a new constellation of fear and hope, stretching between past and future. He watched the city lights blink to life as dusk fell, the night ahead holding questions neither of them was ready to answer. Downtown Chicago wore its sleeplessness well, all neon bruises and sharp edges under the midnight sky. The Michigan Avenue Bridge arched over the river, empty but for the rhythm of passing taxis and the orange wash of streetlights flickering against slick stone. Daniel arrived early, coat buttoned to his chin, collar raised against the damp wind coming off the water. He felt the city's pulse echo in his own chest, expectant, uneasy, bracing for something he couldn't yet name. His footsteps rang hollow as he paced along the walkway, scanning for any sign of movement. The message had been clear, and the warning beneath it clearer still. He stayed in the halo of a street lamp, resisting the urge to sink into the shadows, refusing to let fear dictate his posture. After long minutes, a figure emerged at the far end of the bridge, moving with quick, furtive steps. A woman, mid-50s maybe, wearing a navy ball cap pulled low and a plain tan trench coat. She kept her head down until she drew close enough for Daniel to see the deep lines around her mouth. Daniel Barrett. Her voice was soft, nearly drowned by the low rumble of traffic. I don't have long. My name's Margaret. I worked for Sinclair Group a long time. I handled payroll, wires, everything they didn't want the lawyers to see. She thrust a thick envelope into his hands. Daniel felt the weight of it papers, maybe a flash drive, the unmistakable heft of secrets made real. Margaret looked over her shoulder, her fear almost palpable. Inside are email printouts, transfers, even medical records. Some of it's about you and your wife. Most of it's about Emily. Robert set her up from the start. He used the girls he threatened custody, threatened to go after her mother, anything to make her sign what he wanted. But it's worse than that. Daniel held the envelope tightly, jaw clenched. What do you mean? Margaret's breath came in fast, ragged bursts. Robert stole the medical files from Olivia's trial data. He leaked parts of it, just enough to kill the Barrett innovation stock when it mattered most. He made it look like sabotage from inside. The lawsuits, the press stories, the anonymous tips, they were all him. He knew if he tanked your company, no one would have the money or will to fight him on custody. He ruined both of you, and Emily's never been free. He still watches her, watches the kids. I couldn't live with it anymore. Daniel's hands shook as he sifted through the contents of the envelope names, bank records, time-stamped emails linking Robert directly to the worst days of his life. Rage and sorrow mingled in his chest, a familiar ache twisting sharper with each revelation. Margaret's eyes darted behind him, and she stepped back. Someone's following. I can't be seen. Be careful. Don't trust anyone from Sinclair Group. Especially not their new lawyer. He's on Robert's payroll, and he'll come for the girls if you push too hard. Before Daniel could answer, Margaret slipped away, her footsteps swallowed by the city's noise. Across Michigan Avenue, a tall figure in a black overcoat loitered near the base of a lamppost, face obscured. Daniel stiffened, shifting to keep the river at his back. The man didn't approach, but Daniel saw the deliberate way he watched, the slow flicker of a lighter, the studied patience of a hunter waiting for his mark. Just as Daniel turned to leave, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The message was brief, cold. Walk away from Emily. If you don't, the children will suffer. He stared at the words, the threat crawling over his skin. For a heartbeat, he felt the helplessness of all those years ago the night the headlines hit. The day Olivia wept behind her office door, the slow shattering of hope that followed. But this time, someone else's children were at risk. This time, he was the last line. Daniel hurried off the bridge, pulse thundering, eyes darting to every shadow. The city no longer felt vast. It felt tight, claustrophobic, every window and alley a potential trap. He made it back to his car, barely pausing to breathe before locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. Behind him, the river moved slow and silent under the lights, as if it, too, knew the cost of secrets carried too long. Chicago's South Dearborn Street was never quiet, but that morning the usual hum was sharpened by the restless current of protest. Dozens of voices tangled outside the city's social services office, carrying hand-painted signs and shouted slogans against new welfare restrictions. Police officers stood as a thin blue line near the doors, their patience worn down by days of demonstrations. Daniel parked a block away, uneasy with the tension in the air. Emily walked beside him, holding Lucy's hand, her face set in the calm she wore whenever she felt outnumbered. Inside, the security checkpoint slowed their entry. The building smelled of sanitizer and exhaustion. Daniel led the family up the wide staircase, past the crowd of people waiting on hard plastic chairs. Emily approached the front desk, her voice steady as she requested a meeting with someone in Child and Family Services. The receptionist, a young woman in a gray cardigan, barely looked up as she handed over a stack of forms. "Fill these out. We'll call you when it's your turn." Emily sat on a bench, the girls huddled close, filling in name after name, retelling the same painful story on every page. Daniel tried to catch her eye, offering silent reassurance. He felt out of place here, his tailored suit and expensive watch drawing stares from the others, waiting mostly women, some elderly, some with children in strollers, all worn at the edges. When their names were called, they were led into a small interview room. A middle-aged man with a badge, Mr. Keener, reviewed their forms, eyebrows raised. "You understand? Ms. Reynolds. The department's had several complaints about your fitness as a parent. Anonymous, yes, but still, there's a pattern here." He recited details: a bitter divorce, gaps in Emily's work history, mounting debt, the unstable presence of another adult male in her household. Daniel tried to intervene, explaining he was only providing temporary housing and had no legal stake. But Mr. Keener barely glanced his way. Emily's hands never stopped moving, fingers twisting the strap of her purse, eyes fixed on the table. "I lost my job when my mother got sick. I can prove I've looked for work. My children are well cared for." She produced medical notes, school records, anything to show she was fighting. Keener skimmed the documents with practiced detachment. Through the small window, Daniel saw the protesters outside, now joined by a few news cameras. Inside, the waiting room seemed to press in, every whisper and sideways glance growing louder. Then the door opened, and a new figure entered, a tall, sharp-featured man in a charcoal suit. "Excuse me, I'm Mr. Brower, representing Mr. Robert Sinclair," he announced, flashing a business card with the Sinclair Group logo. He handed Keener a thick folder. "My client is requesting an immediate review of Ms. Reynolds' guardianship status. There are concerns regarding recent behavior, finances, and the welfare of the children. We're also submitting a request for emergency transfer of custody, pending investigation." Emily stared at the lawyer, color draining from her face. "That's not true. He's using money to," Brower cut her off. "The department has a duty to protect vulnerable children. We trust you'll act swiftly." Keener read through the new stack of allegations: unpaid bills, old photos of Emily at bars from years ago, hearsay from neighbors. Emily's voice shook as she tried to explain, but her words fell on deaf ears. Daniel leaned forward, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "This is harassment. He's trying to scare her into giving up her rights. You have to see that." But Keener's response was careful, almost resigned. "We have to follow protocol. Miss Reynolds. Until we finish our review, the children will be placed in temporary care. You'll be notified of next steps within 24 hours. He pressed a form toward her, requesting her signature. Emily's shoulders sagged as she signed. Lucy started to cry. Emma pulled her sisters close, Grace whispering reassurance she didn't feel. 2 social workers entered, gently prying the girls away. Emily pleaded with them, her words lost under the weight of the process, her dignity held together by nothing but stubborn hope. Daniel followed as far as he was allowed, helpless as the girls disappeared down the hall. The building's noise faded until all that was left was the echo of a mother's grief and the cold finality of a locked office door. He found Emily in the corridor, sitting on the floor, Eyes rimmed with tears she refused to shed. Daniel tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. All he could do was sit beside her, his resolve solidifying in the quiet. He knew now that he was all she had left to fight for her. Outside, the protesters' chants rose again, but in the sterile hush of the building, hope felt very far away. Daniel didn't sleep. The ticking of the clock at Highland Park and Associates matched the pulse in his temple as he and Teresa Fields combed through every shred of evidence, every legal brief, every oddity in the records. The harsh office light revealed files spread across the mahogany table custody petitions, transcripts from Emily's divorce, old articles about Barrett Innovations. He saw it now, how Robert Sinclair had manipulated the courts, poisoned the media, and left a trail of doubt in every official record. The law wasn't just indifferent, in the wrong hands. It was a weapon. Daniel's anger simmered, mingling with a sense of guilt that pressed heavier each hour. Years ago, he had chosen retreat over confrontation when Olivia's work and reputation were smeared by false headlines, engineered by Sinclair's backroom deals. Now, watching Emily lose her children, he felt the same helplessness Olivia must have felt as her name was dragged through the mud. He tried to focus on the present, on fixing what he could, but the ghosts of old failures clung to him, refusing to let go. In the sterile holding room at the Family Services Center, Emily sat on a plastic chair, eyes fixed on her reflection in the streaked window. Her hands twisted the hem of her coat until her knuckles ached. She barely heard the low voices around her, the social workers murmuring about court protocols, the distant echo of children's laughter down the hall. The room was cold, the fluorescent lights too bright. Every so often, a worker came in to offer her water, to explain in careful language the steps of the investigation. Emily nodded, but her mind was far away, replaying every harsh word Robert had hurled at her, every mistake she'd made, every time she'd been told she was unfit. Meanwhile, at the city's main children's shelter on North Ashland Avenue, Emma, Grace, Nora, and Lucy were shepherded through the unfamiliar halls by a pair of kind but harried staffers. Each girl was given her own cot and a small box of donated toys, but nothing could fill the void left by their mother's absence. Emma refused to cry in front of the others, her chin set, clutching a tattered stuffed bear. Grace barely spoke, while Nora and Lucy huddled together, listening for footsteps in the corridor that might mean Emily had come for them. Even the youngest could sense that something had changed, something too big for children to name. Back at Highland Park, Daniel poured another coffee, his hands trembling as he scrolled through Margaret's emails and the USB files she'd delivered. Teresa's sharp eye caught an unusual attachment, a short, grainy audio file from a blocked number. She pressed play. A man's voice, low and urgent, said, "If you want the truth, find the old Sinclair office on Fulton Street. There's a safe behind the back wall. That's where he keeps everything: contracts, payoffs, all the things he never wanted a judge to see." Teresa looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. If that safe exists, it could prove Robert's been setting Emily up for years. But we'll need a warrant or a very good reason to get in. Daniel pressed his lips together, weighing the risks. This was no longer just about business or personal history. He knew now what they were up against. He drafted a motion to the Cook County Family Court, attaching the new evidence, and sent an urgent request for an emergency hearing. Every formality felt like walking through sand. All the while, he kept calling Margaret, hoping for another piece of the puzzle. Margaret's phone rang to voicemail. Daniel left a terse message, trying not to sound desperate. Time was running out. As dawn broke, Daniel was ready to head out when his phone buzzed with a restricted call. He answered, voice hoarse. On the other end, a man's laugh, low, cold, familiar. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" "Barrett." The voice lingered, taunting. "Step away, or next time those girls won't be gone for just one night. I can make it last a lot longer." The call ended with a click. Daniel stared at the phone, his reflection fractured in the black screen, knowing the stakes had just risen. He looked out the window, Chicago's skyline bleeding into a new day, every light a silent challenge. Dawn broke with a pale gray over the loop, Chicago's financial heart, pulsing to the rhythm of delivery trucks and coffee carts. Daniel watched the morning crowd from the alley behind the old Sinclair Group building, a faded blue cap pulled low and a shipping box in his arms. Beside him, Teresa Fields wore a courier's vest, her posture stiff, but her eyes steady. The air was sharp with the promise of rain, and every passing minute made his skin prickle with nerves. Margaret's old access badge worked, just as she'd promised. The service door buzzed open, letting in a draft of damp air and the muted rumble of office life upstairs. Daniel moved first, nodding to the janitor pushing a mop cart. Careful to avoid the security cameras Teresa had mapped from the blueprints, inside, the familiar smell of toner and old carpet met the scent he remembered from too many tense meetings in this very building. Years ago, when Barrett Innovations and Sinclair Group had circled each other like wary animals. Down 2 flights of concrete stairs, they entered the storage level. The hum of air conditioning barely masked the beat of Daniel's heart. The door to the archive room was marked Records. He swiped the badge again. This time, a green light. Teresa set to work quickly, scanning the shelves. There were boxes labeled with case numbers, flash drives, and a battered file cabinet in the corner. Daniel focused on a safe embedded in the wall behind the cabinet, painted the same dull gray as everything else. He remembered that safe. Olivia had pointed it out once, back when this was neutral ground. He knelt, pulling out a thin folder taped beneath the bottom shelf. The label read, Barrett Innovations, Litigation, Shy, Transfer. He hesitated. Inside were photocopies of contracts, legal memos, and technical diagrams his company's intellectual property, signed away during the lawsuit years ago. Handwritten notes in red ink circled clauses about non-compete and immediate transfer of all technology. His throat tightened. Here was the proof that Robert Sinclair had forced Olivia's hand, that the ruin of Barrett Innovations wasn't fate or incompetence, it was orchestrated. Teresa's voice broke through. Daniel, over here, external hard drives, unlabeled, but I'll bet this is the real haul. She plugged in her laptop, running a rapid backup, hands moving fast but sure. Daniel glanced at the digital clock on the wall, counting the seconds. The urge to grab and run fought with the need to be thorough. Suddenly, the shrill wail of an alarm shot through the silence. A blinking red light began to flash above the door. Daniel's mind raced. Was it the badge? The hidden camera in the stairwell. Teresa shoved the last hard drive into her bag. Footsteps echoed above, the heavy thud of someone descending fast. Daniel straightened, face calm as the door burst open. 2 guards, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, stepped in, hands hovering near their radios. Daniel forced his voice into the measured tone of an executive who belonged here. I'm Daniel Barrett. My attorney and I are performing a final audit for the insurance review. We've cleared this with the board. Do you want to see the email from Sinclair's office? The guards hesitated, thrown by his confidence and the name. Teresa started scrolling on her phone, ready to produce whatever fake email they'd drafted the night before. Daniel watched the guards closely, every muscle tense. One of the men finally mumbled into his radio. Daniel seized the moment. We'll finish here and be out in 10 minutes. Call your supervisor if you need. But we're on the clock. The bluff worked long enough. Teresa handed Daniel the backup drives, her hands icy cold. Together. They walked briskly back through the stairwell, out into the alley, just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Across the street, a black SUV idled at the curb. Its tinted window slid down, revealing the rough outline of a man in a suit, jaw clenched, phone pressed to his ear. Daniel recognized him, a fixer for Sinclair, always lurking on the margins. The man's voice carried, low and taunting. Barrett, you just don't get it. You're not in control here, in Chicago. People who cross the wrong line end up regretting it. Daniel didn't flinch. Teresa stood at his shoulder, breath held. The city around them pressed close, every shadow suddenly sharper. Night settled over Chicago, a deep quiet broken only by the glow of streetlights across the city's towers. Daniel sat alone at his desk in the penthouse office of Willis Tower. The city laid out in shimmering silence below. Every light seemed like an accusation. He powered up the encrypted drives, headphones pressing tight against his ears, the files from Sinclair Group opening one by one on the screen. The first recording was short, filled with the familiar hum of an office air vent. Robert Sinclair's voice cut through, calm but edged with ice. "If you don't withdraw, Olivia, I promise you, there'll be nothing left for your family. Walk away." The sound of Olivia's breath caught, a moment Daniel would have given anything to erase from his mind. His hand shook, pausing the file, the memory of her last days now taking on a new, cruel clarity. He forced himself to keep listening. Each click of the mouse brought another document to light, a scanned contract, pages and pages of legalese. But behind the bland formality, the signatures told a different story. Here was proof of the fake transfer, where Robert had paid off a third party to sign away rights Olivia never meant to relinquish. There were emails sent under someone else's name, falsified trial results, a tangled web leading all the way to the financial collapse of Barrett Innovations. The margins of some pages were scrawled with reminders: ensure Emily cannot testify, delay regulatory approval, threaten exposure. Daniel's face tightened, lines deepening as the truth bore down. He saw it now. Not only had Robert forced Olivia out, but he'd used Daniel himself as a pawn, feeding him half-truths and encouraging his doubts until Olivia was isolated, her will broken by threats and betrayal. For years, Daniel had carried the shame of her defeat, blaming himself for not fighting harder, not loving her enough to protect her from wolves in suits. Now, it was clear he'd been caught in Robert's trap, blind to the role he'd played. In the next file, a blurry phone video showed Robert in a hallway, speaking to an unknown man. The words were muffled, but the threat was unmistakable. If Barrett's wife testifies, she'll regret it. If Emily tries to run, she'll lose her kids. Daniel watched it twice, each time feeling Olivia's ghost settle heavier on his shoulders. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass window, staring at the city below. Teresa Fields knocked softly before letting herself in, carrying a mug of coffee she knew he wouldn't drink. "You couldn't have known, Daniel," she said quietly, setting the cup down, her eyes kind but unflinching. "But now you do. We can take this to the state attorney, to the media if we have to. You owe it to Olivia and to Emily and her girls." Daniel turned, his voice little more than a whisper. "I thought I was helping her. I pushed her to sign those contracts. I thought it was the only way out. I was wrong. I let Robert get too close. I let him win." Teresa touched his shoulder. "You have a choice now. You can finish what Olivia started, or you can let Robert's threats work one last time." The old pain in Daniel's chest throbbed with every memory every time he'd seen Olivia sitting at this same window, clutching a research file, hope flickering in her eyes even as the lawsuits mounted. That hope had died with her, and Daniel had spent years drowning in what-ifs. But tonight, something hardened inside him. He pulled up his calendar, entering a new appointment. Tomorrow, he would face Robert Sinclair himself at the Langham. There would be no more running, no more hiding behind legal motions or compromise. Teresa watched him, understanding the resolve in his face. "Be careful, Daniel. Robert doesn't play fair, but neither did Olivia. She fought until her last day." He looked at the rain on the window, the city reflected in streaks of silver and black. Down below, the river shimmered like a second sky. He could almost hear Olivia's voice, steady and warm, urging him to fight for what mattered. Daniel picked up his phone, hands steady now, and dialed the Langham's front desk. "Please leave a message for Mr. Robert Sinclair. Tell him Daniel Barrett requests a meeting. It's urgent." He set the phone down and stood by the window, heart pounding, waiting for the city to answer back. Inside the Langham Chicago, the air was crisp with the sterile scent of new carpet and old money. The boardroom at the top floor was all sharp lines and cold glass, every surface gleaming under the sweep of downtown's gray daylight. Robert Sinclair sat at the far end, legs crossed, hands folded on the glass. His eyes never left Daniel as the elevator doors opened and footsteps echoed, slow and certain. Across the marble, Daniel entered with a look that had changed overnight. Gone was the worn exhaustion, replaced by a quiet steel in his jaw and a gaze that seemed to measure the room, not just the man. Teresa followed, case file in one hand, a thumb drive in the other, her presence a silent assurance. Robert's smile was the same polished mask he wore in every press photo, but something flickered behind his eyes as Daniel laid out a manila folder and the USB drive in the middle of the table. Daniel's words cut through the silence, each one deliberate. No room for negotiation. You know what's in here, Robert. Evidence, contracts, emails, financial transfers. Enough to put you in a courtroom for a decade. He didn't sit. He didn't blink. Robert leaned back, unbothered on the surface, voice as smooth as before. You want to ruin my name, Daniel. Think about what that means for Emily, for those kids. Do you really want every detail in the news, every ugly rumor, every lie you're playing with more than your legacy? You're risking theirs. Daniel let the words hang, but he saw the twitch in Robert's jaw, the tiny break in his facade. He replied, "Quieter now. You're the one who made this personal. You used Olivia's death, used my mistakes, and now you're still hiding behind threats. I'm not running from you again." Teresa slid a sheet across the table, an official notice, stamped by the Illinois Attorney General's office. "The full data is already with state authorities," she said, her voice low and unflinching. "We've also delivered it to the family court. It's out of your hands. Robert." The next few minutes blurred with legal threats. Robert insisting nothing would hold up. Daniel refusing to raise his voice. The room was charged with a kind of silent violence, each man knowing the other's pain and guilt, neither backing down. For the first time, Robert seemed truly rattled, fingers drumming, forehead creasing as he scrolled through messages on his phone. He muttered, almost to himself, "This isn't how it ends." But something in his posture had changed, his shoulders drawn in, his confidence cracked. Daniel stayed standing. It's over. For Emily, for the kids, for Olivia. His words felt heavy but final. Teresa gathered the evidence, nodded once to Daniel, and the three of them made for the door. As they reached the elevator, uniformed officers appeared in the hallway, their steps sure. One officer, badge shining, stepped forward and addressed Robert. "Mr. Sinclair, you're being investigated for unfair business practices, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. Please stay in the building." Robert tried to protest, but the officer's voice was flat, practiced. In that moment, Daniel almost felt pity for him, but only for a second. Meanwhile, across town, Emily sat on the edge of a twin bed in her temporary room, heart pounding as she answered a call from her attorney. She barely heard the words at first. "You're being summoned to family court, Emily. This is your chance to fight for your children." Her fingers clenched the bedsheet, fear and hope crashing together as she stood and moved toward the window. Back in the corridor, Daniel paused by a window overlooking the Chicago River, watching the current drift below. He felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in years. There was a new uncertainty, but it wasn't fear. As the elevator doors slid open, Daniel turned, and the last thing he saw was Robert's face, pale and still, framed by a city that was already moving on. The morning light cut through the stained windows of Cook County Courthouse, landing in harsh bands across the polished floor. The courtroom was already crowded. There was a tension in the air you could almost touch, strangers in dark suits. The steady scribble of reporters, the sharp clatter of a gavel that called the room to order. On one side of the aisle, Daniel sat close to Emily, his hand resting on her shoulder, a quiet gesture that said more than any word. Emily's eyes stayed low, jaw set, trying to steady her breathing, while across the aisle, Robert Sinclair and his attorney wore their confidence like armor, but it was thin at the seams. Judge Silverman presided with an unblinking gaze. She'd seen too many parents fight over children, too many lies disguised as love. The first questions came sharp, meant to cut through any rehearsal about finances, daily routines, where the children had spent their nights these last weeks, and the trail of distress that had led Emily here. Daniel watched Emily grip the table's edge as she spoke, voice soft but clear. She answered every question, sometimes closing her eyes for a second before each reply, not to hide, but to steady herself against the weight of the room. Robert tried to control the narrative, painting Emily as unstable, unfit, prone to erratic choices, and incapable of providing a home. His lawyer read from anonymous complaints and scattered records, each one designed to sting. But when Daniel's turn came, his words were direct and calm. He spoke of the relentless pressure that had built around Emily, the traps laid not just by life, but by someone determined to see her fail. He did not look at Robert when he said it, but the meaning lingered. Teresa Fields, always measured, rose next. She submitted the new evidence in silence, a stack of documents, the printed emails, the old contract, and the digital recording, her voice never rising above a steady cadence. Judge Silverman took it all, pausing for longer than seemed necessary as she flipped through the pages. Then she pressed play on the recording. The sound of Robert's threats filled the room, a cold echo that made even the court reporter pause mid-typing. The twist arrived quietly, in the way the judge's eyes flicked from the evidence to Robert, in the hush that followed, as Olivia Barrett's old email was read aloud. It was Olivia, years earlier, warning of what would happen if she refused to yield to Sinclair's demands. The pattern was clear. The manipulation was no longer just rumor, it was fact. Even Robert's lawyer looked away. When Emily stood to answer one last time, her hands were steady. Her voice did not break. She spoke, not of revenge or anger, but of her children. She told the court she was not a perfect mother, nor was she trying to erase the past. She wanted, simply, for her daughters to wake up free from the shadow of fear. Her words were ordinary, but something in the way she said them drew every eye. For a long moment, Robert was silent. His face was drained of certainty, eyes fixed on the polished wood in front of him. The fight in him had shifted. Daniel could see it, and so could Emily, though she didn't dare look at him. Judge Silverman leaned forward, announcing that she would review every file and piece of evidence, and would issue a final ruling within 24 hours. Until then, she ordered the children remain in state custody, a blow that left Emily staring at her hands, pain etched deep, while Daniel struggled to find any word that might comfort her. As the court emptied, Daniel lingered by the window, watching the streetcars pass below, thinking of all the nights he'd watched the city and felt nothing at all. Emily did not speak. She simply waited. Hope and worry entwined so tightly, neither could breathe. Night hung heavy over the Chicago Children's Shelter on West Harrison, shadows flickering in the corridor lights as silence settled deeper with each passing hour. In the girls' shared room, Emma woke first, blinking in the unfamiliar dark. She reached for Grace, pressing her face close to her sister's ear. "Do you think Mom is coming back tomorrow?" Emma whispered. Grace only nodded, her hand clutching the thin blanket like a lifeline. Her small body curled inward against the cold edges of worry. Across the room, Nora and Lucy huddled together on their cot. Nora wiped tears away with the back of her hand, trying not to let Lucy see. But Lucy's eyes were wide open, and her voice trembled. "I want to go home," she mouthed, barely audible. For hours. The girls lay awake, listening to every sound in the hallway, wondering if any set of footsteps would bring their mother's voice, or just another tired social worker with a kind but empty smile. Downstairs, the staff kept busy with paperwork and low conversations, their faces worn from too many cases like this: good kids, worried parents, and a system that moved too slow. Every so often, an aide peeked in on the girls, offered water or a gentle word. But the comfort was thin, the fear too deep-rooted. Even the other children sensed it. When the lights flicked on for bed checks, Emma squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the world would speed up, deliver her back to a place where bedtime meant her mother's arms and not four strange walls. Outside, the city kept moving, but on the cold stone bench just beyond Grant Park, Daniel and Emily sat side by side in the weak glow of a street lamp. Daniel's hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup gone cold long ago. Emily pulled her coat tighter. Her face turned toward the park, gaze lost somewhere between the trees and the skyline. Neither spoke for a long time. Everything had already been said too much, and not enough. Daniel felt the weight of every wrong turn. Every second he'd been too late. Emily, sensing his regret, finally looked at him. There was gratitude in her eyes, and a question she couldn't quite voice. Could this man anyone truly change the tide, just as the night threatened to swallow what little hope remained? Teresa Field's phone vibrated. Margaret, once a silent figure on the sidelines, stood under the awning, her breath visible in the chill. She handed Teresa a flash drive and an envelope. Her hands shook as she did it. "This is everything," she whispered. Inside was a copy of security footage, grainy, time-stamped, and damning. It showed Robert Sinclair in a shadowed office, instructing his people to interfere not just with contracts, but directly with the guardianship filings and shelter transfer paperwork. Names, faces, orders clear as day. Teresa didn't hesitate. She drove to the courthouse, lights blurring past, and uploaded the video to the judge's secure case portal. Emily's phone buzzed a moment later. "Teresa says it's sent," she whispered, voice trembling between relief and disbelief. But the night wasn't finished. Daniel's phone rang a number he didn't know, the caller's voice low and controlled. "One more step. Bear it, and you'll lose everything. Family, friends, business, don't test me." The words landed cold, but something in Daniel was different now. He looked at Emily, her strength shining through exhaustion, and knew there was nothing left to fear. He hung up without replying. In the shelter, Emma finally drifted to sleep, dreaming of sunlight and her mother's arms. Emily watched her phone for updates, Daniel's hand steady on her shoulder, neither willing to let the other go. The city around them was quiet, but a new kind of resolve had begun to settle, calm and solid as the river at dawn. The early morning sun had barely burned away the city mist, yet the Cook County courtroom was already alive with tension. Reporters crowded the benches, their pens ready, while lawyers in dark suits shuffled papers and cast anxious glances toward the front. In the heart of it, Daniel stood at Emily's side, his hands in his pockets, eyes trained on Judge Silverman. The judge, stoic and focused, reviewed his notes as if the whole room depended on his next breath. Emily fidgeted, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve, but her back was straight. Daniel caught her eye and gave a small nod, steady and reassuring, though the storm inside him showed in his tight jaw. The children were not there, but their absence was as heavy as if 4 small chairs had been left empty. In the last pew, Margaret sat quietly, her gaze fixed forward, ready to speak when called. The session opened with a measured calm. Judge Silverman addressed the court, his words deliberate and clear. He had reviewed every document, every recording, every late-night message sent in a rush of hope or fear. He spoke of the gravity of parental rights and the lifelong weight of decisions made within these walls. For a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret was summoned first. She stepped up, hands trembling only slightly, and confirmed everything. She described Robert Sinclair's years of manipulation, his threats, the way he had orchestrated deals in shadows and forced signatures under pressure. She recounted the night she passed the crucial video to Teresa and how long she'd been afraid to speak. Margaret's voice never rose, but the room leaned in, every word laying another stone of truth in a wall Robert could no longer climb. Robert sat rigid beside his lawyer, his composure cracked, the arrogance replaced by a look of naked defeat. His attorney's questions faltered, objections grew weaker. Judge Silverman pressed on, reviewing the sequence of emails, the forged contracts, the damning footage. With every answer, the Sinclair camp shrank further, like shadows retreating at sunrise. Then it was Emily's turn. She stood, voice steady but eyes shimmering with emotion, admitting to her past fears, her mistakes, but clarifying her single motive to keep her daughters safe, to let them grow beyond the weight of their parents' failures. She spoke of sleepless nights in the shelter, the sting of suspicion, the ache of separation. No one looked away. Even the bailiff softened his stance, glancing at her with an empathy rarely shown in this place. Finally, Judge Silverman delivered his verdict. The room froze, every sound suspended as he pronounced that custody and care of Emma, Grace, Nora, and Lucy would return to Emily. He acknowledged Daniel Barrett as their legal and financial guardian, a quiet nod to the healing his presence had brought. Robert Sinclair was found guilty of unfair competition and abusing the foster system for personal gain. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp sound that signaled both an ending and a beginning. Tears slid down Emily's face as Daniel reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next, together. The legal team gathered up their files, reporters prepared their headlines, and Margaret let out a breath she'd been holding for years. Robert sat, hollowed and silent, the weight of truth too much to bear. As the courtroom emptied, a young reporter approached Daniel near the double doors. "Mr. Barrett, what's next for Barrett Innovations? And what about you and Emily?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He smiled, quiet and knowing, his eyes drifting to where Emily hugged her daughters in a shaft of late afternoon light. Outside, Chicago hummed as always, but for the first time in a long time, the future seemed wide open. Evening light drifted through the small apartment above the garage on North Clark Street, softening the sharp lines of the city outside. Laughter echoed through the kitchen, carried by the scent of homemade soup and golden toast. Emma and Grace argued over who would stir the pot, their voices bright and real. Nora set the napkins, her hair a wild mess after a day's worth of games, while Lucy trailed behind Daniel, one hand tugging at his sleeve as he poured orange juice with practiced care. Emily stood at the window, her gaze following the slow crawl of cars along the boulevard below. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders for years began to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of arrival. She watched as Daniel adjusted a scarf around Lucy's neck, smoothing it with the gentleness of someone who had lost and finally found again. In his movements, she saw not only kindness, but the silent healing of old wounds. Teresa arrived just before dusk, her arms full of papers and her smile wide. She handed over the guardianship contract, the ink still fresh, and hugged Emily a little longer than usual. "It's really done," she whispered, eyes shining with relief and gratitude. Margaret's message chimed on Emily's phone, a simple congratulations, filled with more feeling than any courtroom speech. The meal was noisy, messy, real. Daniel sat between the girls, answering questions about science and telling stories from his youth, the walls that once held secrets, now reflecting laughter. Emma leaned into Emily, whispering with a worried hope, "Mom, we're really home now, aren't we?" Emily brushed a hand across her daughter's cheek, smiling through quiet tears, her answer spoken in the small, unbreakable warmth between them, outside. The world slowed. Sunlight streaked the bricks of the neighborhood, casting everything in gold. Daniel stood on the porch after dinner, looking out toward the skyline where Willis Tower caught the last rays of day. His heart felt light for the first time in years. No shadows of courtroom battles or veiled threats. No echoes of loss. Only the chorus of children's laughter drifting through the open window and the gentle sound of Emily's voice calling them to dessert. Nobody mentioned what had come before, the threats or betrayals, the nights spent doubting whether hope was anything more than a foolish promise. They didn't need to. What remained was not the memory of pain, but the resolve to do better, each of them holding a piece of forgiveness, a private vow to build something lasting and real. Even Margaret, from a quiet apartment miles away, felt the soft ripple of peace settling in. Chicago glowed as the last of the sun faded, streetlights blinking on one by one. Daniel watched the city breathe, the distant hum of traffic mixing with the music of a home, rebuilt from trust and patience. He let himself believe, for the first time, that sometimes light does find its way through even the narrowest cracks. Emily turned from the window and met Daniel's eyes. She didn't speak, but he understood. This was what they'd been searching for, all along. Evening light curled around the edges of the old window, falling across a table where laughter lingered longer than any shadow. Out on the street, life kept rushing by, unaware that somewhere above, hope was busy mending what had been torn. Sometimes, the world doesn't notice when burdens get a little lighter, or when trust returns in the form of an unguarded smile. Maybe it's not the grand gestures that change us, but the quiet courage to keep opening the door. In the hush that follows struggle, a different kind of promise takes root. Who's to say where it leads, or how many hearts it might reach? And maybe, just maybe, peace comes not all at once, but in gentle, ordinary moments, waiting to be noticed.